Okay, so this is going to be the hedonism video as promised a couple days ago. I was going to film the hedonism video from the hedonistic swimming pool just outside of my door, but I figured that despite having a new microphone, a very sensitive new microphone, and hopefully no more audio problems for a while, it's probably not the best idea to talk about sex and drugs and everything in front of people's little kids. So, being the good person I am, I'm going to film indoors instead in the new and improved dining room where there is no longer a dining room table. I decided on a whim yesterday morning to throw away my dining room table. Chalk it up to minimalism or whatever. Okay, so hedonism. Why are we talking about hedonism right now? Well, two things have come up recently in my life that have kind of drawn me back to the topic of hedonism. Number one, I have a friend of mine who is under the impression that he is closing in on death and that he's dying a lot sooner than he otherwise expected. So he is asking a lot of questions pertaining to how to live out the rest of a shortened life. Is it better to go purely hedonism out, sex, drugs, and whatnot till the bitter end, or what are there other alternatives? And then the other thing is, like, I finally, after years of trying to convince one of my friends to read Marquis de Sade's book, she finally did, and she loves it, and so we've been talking about it. I don't agree with everything. Marquis de Sade was a French philosopher from like the 17th century, I think, and I chalk him up as one of the most intelligent people to ever walk the earth. And even though like I don't agree with everything he says, like I think that anyone who can handle it should read his stuff because like it's extremely well written and extremely impactful. And hedonism plays a big role in his philosophy. So, yeah. So, hedonism, like when people hear the word hedonism, a couple things are drawn up. You might have this imagery of like smoking opium in the middle of a harem or something, or maybe it's like laying on one of those cuddle puddles at a rave. Or hedonism, everyone's got their own idea of it, but it's usually some type of carnal desire and lavish decadence and whatnot. And I think we've all went through a phase when we were younger where we were self-described as hedonists. I think for me at least, it followed my nihilism phase. Like when I was in high school, like I got really, I felt really deeply into just like nihilism and the belief that life is meaningless and just depression and sadness from that. And while I still pretty much believe that, gun to my head and, the main philosophies of the world out there, I'm going to probably go with like nihilism. But I don't, moving from nihilism to hedonism was an effort on my part to make peace with nihilism and to make peace with the fact that life was pointless and nothing mattered. So, yeah, so if life is pointless and nothing matters, we might as well just follow our biological instincts and, like the animals, people will say, pursue pleasure and avoid pain. And essentially, that's what hedonism is as a philosophy. It is the idea of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. The concept of pleasure being analogous to the idea of happiness, and pain being analogous to misery. So, a life that is pursuing happiness is pursuing pleasure, and a life that is avoiding misery is avoiding pain, and these are simultaneously done. So the hedonist is someone who lives his or her life according to the tenets of pursuing pleasure and happiness and avoiding pain and misery. That's all it is. Now, hedonism's been around for thousands of years. And it's always like hedonism versus something that's like its polar opposite. Like back in ancient Greece, it was like what Stoicism was the big rival. It was like there was Epicureanism and Stoicism. Those were like the two camps that were opposed to one another, and hedonism was part of the Epicurean camp. And Stoicism instead was like all about like virtue and ethics and morals and that kind of stuff. Kind of like, kind of like a predecessor of Puritanism, puritanical beliefs or whatever. I don't know exactly how to say the proper long form of the word. And yeah, like a lot of us experience this in our own lives, not in so much like an abstract philosophical notion, but like, parents, teachers, authority figures, or whatnot, trying to tell us how to live. And none of us liked that. None of us liked it at all. And we all went through rebellious phases where it was like, yeah, let's get involved in things like sex and drugs and violence and outrage and whatnot. And it felt good because it was a way to fly it in the face of these goody goodies around us that there are other ways to live. And philosophical hedonism, now there's going to be kind of a buzzkill element to this because your big hedonist philosophers out there, Epicurus, John Stuart Mill, we've heard that name before. These big names, they all do one thing that goes against the rebellious teenager spirit, and that's that they put the highest virtue on like psychological pleasure, meaning what is the word they use? I forget the philosophical term for it, but it's like there's physical carnal pleasure, and it's like at the bottom of the pleasure hierarchy for all of these philosophers. Whereas like I'm gonna drive myself nuts not remembering the name of the attitudinal pleasure. That's what the philosophical term is. Attitudinal pleasure would be something like studying, math or studying music or viewing art. It's not something that's affecting the body directly, but it's still bringing pleasure and happiness, knowledge, finding knowledge and wisdom and everything. And yeah, like the reason why they're going to put the physical pleasures at the bottom of the hierarchy is going to be, I mean, it's kind of common. It's common sense because the physical pleasures are the first ones to turn on you. Like you can go 20, 30 years, studying art or science or whatever and get every day that renewed sense of pleasure and happiness from it. But you can't do that with heroin or, hookups on Tinder or whatever it is. Like things backfire. They backfire very bad when you just deal with the physical pleasures. And like I'm sure we've all been into a phase where we've like sat down on a message board maybe and been like, okay, so what's the most times per week that I can take heroin without getting physically addicted? And like you have this like optimization problem that's going on in your head of like, what's the optimal frequency where I can experience physical pleasure without it leading to pain, or at least maybe like us nerdy people have kind of strategized in this way before. But yeah, like it's just the physical pleasures are the lowest ones because they are not sustainable and therefore they shouldn't be prioritized because prioritizing them over the ones that are sustainable will set a person up for failure. And if someone falls into let's just say it's like drug addiction, is doing heroin every day and suffering all the pain that comes with that, is that consistent with the idea of pursuing happiness? Obviously not. It's funny enough, like you could argue that. Sorry, my hand fell asleep from holding the camera, and I'm trying to like figure out how to like wake it back up. Um, like pursuing knowledge about drugs, for example, like becoming a drug nerd, not doing the drugs, but just becoming like a drug nerd. That could be argued as more congruent with hedonism because you're giving yourself a psychological pleasure over the learning about the topic, and so on. And you could also make the argument, just to be fair, you can make the argument then like someone who gets off drugs and derives enjoyment and pleasure from getting through days sober. Your 12-step types or whatever that genuinely enjoy being sober. I'm not one of them. I don't mind being sober, but people will be like, my worst day sober is better than my best day on drugs. And I'm like, what, are you nuts? My worst day sober. Like yesterday, I had a horrible, horrible day. Horrible day. Bad stuff happened all day. Hence, there were no videos. I was engaged in horrible things. How does that compare with, laying on a couch taking ecstasy with two beautiful women around me and stuff? Like, of course the best days on drugs are better. People are just virtue signaling when they say that kind of stuff, I swear. Anyway, tangent. So yeah, like, and then like there's the idea of like, I'll talk on this channel about like the concept of voluntary hardship and voluntary suffering for future for future reward and pleasure. Like, my example is going to the gym. Go to the gym an hour every day. It sucks. It sucks getting under that kind of weight and squatting. It sucks doing cardio. It is not fun. If you're training at a high level, working out is not fun. It is incredibly stressful and nerve-wracking. But the reward is amazing. Like being strong, having good cardiovascular health, feeling youthful and everything, it's great. So how would the hedonist interpret the idea of the voluntarily going through hardship in order to, like, how does that, is that congruent with hedonism? How do you finagle that? Because if you're going to say like voluntary hardship for future pleasure is congruent with hedonism, then you could almost do a hand wavy argument to say that going through the heroin lifestyle and going through heroin withdrawal would be voluntary hardship in order to enjoy the benefits of heroin when you do get it. You know what I'm trying to say? Like these things you can argue. I mean, if you're clever enough intellectually, you can argue anything. And I mean, I know us nerds like doing that, but not everybody does. People just want the juicy stories from my past, some of them. Anyway, so hedonism, though, like a lot of it too is just like it's a term that we falsely, slightly inappropriately give to just teenage outrage, like I was saying before. The idea of living, let's just say, like the heroin lifestyle and being a heroin addict, a public heroin addict in society, the shock value that people get from seeing your heroin addiction in mainstream society, it's like people get high off of inflicting society with shock value. So the idea of like identifying and proudly identifying as a drug addict or a sex aficionado or whatever it is, and to do it not only because you enjoy or whatever, but because you enjoy the gasps and the shocks that you get from society, that is the Marquis de Sade hedonism. Marquis de Sade was a sexual sadist who did a lot of stuff that not many of us would want to get quite to that extreme in our own private lives. But he and his followers, like crazy stuff went down, and they enjoyed it because they enjoyed the shock value that it inflicted on the culture at the time. So hedonism as bathing and being intoxicated by the shock value that you inflict on other people, we can relate to that if we've ever kind of enjoyed the idea of being a drug addict and a rebel or whatever, enjoyed flaunting that against society, which, that traces back to what I was saying before about, just wanting to do whatever it takes to give the middle finger to the people who try to censor you and hold you back as you were growing up. So yeah, so to just tie this together, hedonism as a philosophy, it's more of a psychological movement, and it's an idea of, in the absence necessarily of a belief in morals or ethics or stuff derived from a religion or whatever, it's a way to make peace with an idea that life might not actually have meaning. You assign meaning to just meeting your basic animalistic needs, pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain. And it is, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a bad way to live. It's kind of congruent with some Buddhist teachings. And yeah, like, it's just when people want to falsely claim hedonism is just, wanton sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's hedonism. That's hedonistic at the start, sure, but I mean, we all know where that goes.